I never thought I would come home from a business trip to find my house completely without water. But that is exactly what happened on a humid Tuesday afternoon in June when I pulled into my driveway in Riverside, California. My name is Nathan Lawson, and I had just spent 3 days in Phoenix closing a major deal for the software company I work for. I was exhausted, sweaty, and looking forward to a long, cold shower. Instead, I turned the faucet in my kitchen and got nothing but a weak sputter followed by complete silence. At first, I assumed it was a neighborhood issue. Maybe the city was doing maintenance, or there had been a pipe burst somewhere on the block. I walked outside and checked with my neighbor, Tom, who was watering his lawn with a perfectly functioning garden hose. He looked at me with confusion when I asked if his water was working. "Yeah, mine's fine," Tom said, scratching his head. "You might want to check your main valve or call the water company." I went back inside and did exactly that. The water company representative I spoke with seemed equally confused. She pulled up my account and confirmed that there were no service interruptions in my area, no missed payments, and no work orders for my address. "Everything looks normal on our end, Mr. Lawson," she said. "Have you checked your water meter and the shut-off valve at the street?" I had not, mainly because I had never needed to before. I grabbed a flashlight from my garage and headed out to the front yard. My water meter was located in a concrete box near the curb, covered by a heavy metal lid. I pried it open with a screwdriver and immediately saw the problem. The shut-off valve, which should have been in the open position parallel to the pipe, was turned perpendicular, completely cutting off water flow to my house. Someone had deliberately turned off my water. My mind raced through possibilities. This was not something that happened accidentally. You had to use a special tool or a wrench to turn that valve, and it required significant force. I turned it back to the open position and heard the satisfying sound of water rushing through the pipes. I went back inside, turned on the kitchen faucet, and watched as water flowed normally again. But the question remained: who had done this and why? I did not have to wait long for an answer. About 20 minutes later, my doorbell rang with an aggressive, impatient rhythm that immediately put me on edge. I opened the door to find a woman in her mid-50s standing on my porch with her arms crossed, and a scowl that could curdle milk. She had short blonde hair styled in that distinctive, "I want to speak to the manager" cut, and she was wearing a polo shirt with the Oak Valley Homeowners Association logo embroidered on it. "Are you Nathan Lawson?" she demanded, not bothering with pleasantries. "I am. Can I help you?" "I am Sharon Whitfield, president of the Oak Valley HOA," she said, her voice sharp and accusatory. "I turned off your water this morning because you are in violation of multiple community guidelines." I stared at her, genuinely stunned. "You did what?" "You heard me correctly. Your lawn is overgrown, you have not repainted your mailbox to match the approved color scheme, and your trash cans were visible from the street last Thursday. I sent you multiple notices." I felt anger rising in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. "First of all, I have been out of town for 3 days on business. Second, even if what you are saying is true, you cannot just turn off someone's water. That is illegal." Sharon's face turned slightly red, but her expression remained defiant. "The HOA covenants give me the authority to take necessary measures to enforce compliance. You signed those covenants when you purchased your home. No covenant gives you the right to cut off someone's utilities," I said, my voice getting harder. "That is tampering with infrastructure you do not own, and it is a crime. I will turn it off again if you do not address these violations immediately," she threatened, jabbing her finger toward me. "You have 48 hours." She turned and walked back to her white SUV parked on the street, leaving me standing in my doorway, absolutely furious. I went back inside and immediately started searching through my files for the HOA documents I had received when I bought the house 2 years ago. I had admittedly not paid much attention to them at the time, but I was certain there was nothing in there that authorized the HOA to shut off utilities. I spent the next hour reading through the covenants, bylaws, and architectural guidelines. There were plenty of rules about lawn maintenance, exterior paint colors, and where trash cans could be stored, but absolutely nothing about utility shutoffs as an enforcement mechanism. In fact, the documents outlined a specific procedure for violations: written notice, opportunity to cure, fines if not corrected, and ultimately a lien on the property if fines went unpaid. Nowhere did it mention physically preventing access to essential services. I took photos of my lawn, which honestly looked fine. Maybe it was an inch or two longer than some of my neighbors, but it was nowhere near overgrown. My mailbox was slightly faded, but certainly not an eyesore. And yes, I had left my trash cans out on Thursday because I had left for my trip early that morning and had not had time to bring them in before the usual deadline. These were minor issues at best, and certainly nothing that warranted cutting off my water supply. I called the non-emergency police line and explained the situation. The dispatcher listened patiently and then told me that an officer would come by to take a report. About 45 minutes later, a young officer named Rodriguez arrived at my door. He was professional and thorough, taking notes as I explained what had happened. "So let me make sure I understand," Officer Rodriguez said. "The HOA president came to your property, accessed the water shut-off valve at the street, and turned it off without your permission, correct?" She admitted it to my face. "And she does not work for the water company. No, she is just a homeowner in the neighborhood who happens to be the HOA president." Officer Rodriguez nodded slowly. "That is tampering with utility infrastructure. It could be considered vandalism, and depending on how the district attorney wants to pursue it, possibly a more serious charge since it affected your access to essential services." He took down Sharon's information and told me he would file a report. He also suggested that I document everything and consider consulting with an attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. I thanked him and closed the door, feeling slightly better. At least the police took it seriously. The next morning, I woke up early and went outside to check on my water meter. To my absolute disbelief, the valve had been turned off again. I felt a surge of rage as I turned it back on. Sharon had come back, probably in the middle of the night, and shut it off again despite our confrontation and the police report. This time, I was not going to just sit back and handle it through official channels. I went to my garage and found a small padlock that fit through the holes in the valve handle, effectively locking it in the open position. It was not pretty, but it would prevent anyone from turning it off without bolt cutters. I also set up one of my home security cameras on my front porch, angling it so it had a clear view of the water meter box. If Sharon came back again, I would have video evidence. Then I started making calls. I found an attorney named David Chen who specialized in HOA law and had excellent reviews online. His office was able to squeeze me in that afternoon for a consultation. I gathered all my documents, the photos I had taken, the HOA covenants, and the police report number Officer Rodriguez had given me. David Chen was in his early 40s, sharp-eyed and immediately focused when I walked into his office. I laid out the entire situation for him, and I watched his expression grow more serious as I spoke. "This is one of the more egregious HOA overreaches I have seen in a while," David said, leaning back in his chair. "The behavior you are describing crosses several legal lines. Shutting off your water is not just a civil matter. It is criminal tampering, and it could potentially be charged as assault depending on how aggressive the DA wants to be. Assault? I asked, surprised. Denying access to water is denying access to a basic human necessity. In California, there are specific statutes protecting utility access. What she did was not just against HOA rules or general property law. She interfered with infrastructure owned and maintained by the water company, and she did so with the intent to harm you or coerce you into compliance. David explained that we had several options. We could pursue a civil lawsuit against both Sharon personally and the HOA for damages and injunctive relief. We could also push for criminal prosecution. Given that she had now turned off my water twice, he recommended we do both. "Here is what I suggest," David said, pulling out a legal pad. "We send a cease and desist letter immediately to both Sharon and the HOA board. We demand that she stop interfering with your utilities and that the board clarify in writing that they do not authorize such actions. We also file for a temporary restraining order if she continues this behavior. On the criminal side, you need to go back to the police and report the second incident. Make sure they understand this is ongoing harassment." I agreed to everything. David said he would have the cease and desist letter drafted and sent by the end of the day. I left his office feeling like I finally had some backup. When I got home, I checked my security camera footage. Sure enough, at 2:30 that morning, a white SUV had pulled up in front of my house. Sharon had gotten out, walked over to my water meter, opened the box, and turned off the valve. The footage was clear and time-stamped. She had not even tried to hide what she was doing. I downloaded the video and immediately drove to the police station to file another report. This time, I spoke with a detective named Lisa Morrison who worked in the Property Crimes Division. I showed her the video, and her eyebrows went up. "This is good evidence," Detective Morrison said. "This shows clear intent and premeditation." She came back after being confronted and after a police report was filed. That shows a pattern of behavior. She took a copy of the video and added it to the case file. She told me that they would be forwarding the case to the district attorney's office with a recommendation for prosecution. She also said that she would personally reach out to Sharon and inform her that any further tampering would result in immediate arrest. "We take utility tampering very seriously," Detective Morrison explained. "Especially when it involves water. People need water to live. This is not like someone keying your car. This is interfering with your health and safety." I went home that evening feeling cautiously optimistic. Between the attorney, the police, and the video evidence, I felt like I was finally in a position to fight back against Sharon's absurd power trip. The next day, David called to tell me that the cease and desist letter had been sent via certified mail and email to both Sharon and the entire HOA board. He had also filed a motion for a temporary restraining order, and we had a court date set for the following week. "I also took the liberty of reaching out to some of your neighbors," David said. "I wanted to see if Sharon has a history of this kind of behavior. And does she?" "Oh yes. I spoke with 4 different homeowners who have had run-ins with her. One couple was threatened with fines because their Christmas lights were up 2 days past the HOA deadline. Another family was harassed because their teenage son parked his car on the street instead of in the driveway. None of them experienced anything as extreme as what she did to you, but there is definitely a pattern of overreach and intimidation." This was valuable information. It showed that Sharon was not just overzealous about my property specifically. She had a track record of abusing her position. Over the next few days, things escalated in ways I did not anticipate. I started receiving emails from other board members of the HOA. Most of them were apologetic and claimed they had no idea Sharon had turned off my water. A few were defensive, suggesting that I must have done something to provoke such action. One board member, a woman named Patricia, called me directly. "I want you to know that the board did not authorize what Sharon did," Patricia said, her voice nervous. "We had no idea she was going around turning off utilities. That is completely outside the scope of her authority." "Then why is she still the president?" I asked. "We are working on that. There is going to be an emergency board meeting this weekend. Several of us are planning to call for a vote of no confidence." "Good. She should not be in any position of authority if this is how she behaves." Patricia hesitated before speaking again. "I also want to warn you, Sharon is not taking this well. She has been calling board members nonstop, insisting that she was within her rights and that you are the problem. She is talking about countersuing you for harassment." I almost laughed. "Harassment? I am not the one who snuck onto someone's property in the middle of the night to turn off their water." "I know. I am just telling you so you are prepared. She is not backing down." After I hung up with Patricia, I felt a mix of frustration and vindication. It was becoming clear that Sharon had gone rogue, and that even her own board was turning against her. But it was also clear that she was doubling down instead of admitting she had made a mistake. The temporary restraining order hearing arrived the following Tuesday. I met David at the courthouse in downtown Riverside, and we went through security together. The courtroom was small and mostly empty, except for a few other cases on the docket. Sharon arrived with her own attorney, a stern-looking man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as Gregory Palmer. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Judge Hawkins, reviewed the filings and then asked David to present our case. He laid out the facts clearly and concisely, showing the video footage of Sharon turning off my water and emphasizing that this was the second time she had done it. He argued that I needed protection from ongoing harassment and interference with essential services. Gregory Palmer stood up and tried to argue that Sharon had been acting in her capacity as HOA president and that the covenants gave her broad enforcement powers. Judge Hawkins cut him off. "Counselor, I have reviewed the HOA covenants, and there is nothing in there that authorizes the shutoff of utilities. Even if there were, that would not override California state law, which protects access to water. Your client tampered with infrastructure she does not own, and she did so twice after being confronted. Do you have any legal basis for that behavior?" Gregory Palmer looked flustered. "Your Honor, my client believes she was acting within her authority as granted by the community rules." "Belief is not the same as legal authority," Judge Hawkins said sharply. "The temporary restraining order is granted. Miss Whitfield is prohibited from coming within 100 feet of Mr. Lawson's property, and she is specifically prohibited from interfering with any utilities servicing his home. Violation of this order will result in immediate arrest for contempt. Do you understand, Miss Whitfield?" Sharon stood up, her face bright red. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous. He is the one violating community standards. I was just doing my job." "Your job does not include breaking the law," Judge Hawkins said coldly. "You are very close to being held in contempt right now. I suggest you sit down and listen to your attorney." Sharon sat down, but I could see her hands shaking with anger. The hearing concluded, and David and I walked out of the courtroom together. "That went well," David said with a slight smile. "Judge Hawkins does not tolerate HOA overreach. I have been in front of her before, and she is very protective of homeowner rights." "What happens next?" I asked. "Now we wait for the criminal case to proceed. The DA's office should be making a decision soon about whether to file charges. In the meantime, you are protected by the restraining order. If Sharon comes near your property or touches your utilities again, she will be arrested. I went home that day feeling like I had won a significant battle, but I knew the war was not over. Sharon was clearly unhinged, and I had no idea what she might do next. The HOA held their emergency board meeting that Saturday. I was not invited, but Patricia called me afterward to fill me in. According to her, it had been a chaotic and heated affair. Sharon had refused to step down, insisting that she had done nothing wrong and that the board should be supporting her, not undermining her. Several board members had argued that her actions had exposed the HOA to serious legal liability and that she needed to resign immediately. It got pretty ugly, Patricia said. Sharon accused us of being weak and said that if we did not back her up, the neighborhood would fall into chaos with everyone ignoring the rules. What happened with the vote? We passed a vote of no confidence by a margin of 5-2. Sharon is no longer the president. We appointed Michael, one of the other board members, as interim president. We are also going to hold a special election next month to fill the position properly. Is Sharon still on the board? Technically, yes, but we have stripped her of any enforcement authority. She is basically a board member in name only at this point. This was good news, but I had a feeling it would only make Sharon angrier. People like her did not take kindly to losing power. I was right. 2 days later, I received a letter in the mail from Gregory Palmer's law firm. It was a notice that Sharon was suing me personally for defamation, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The lawsuit claimed that I had made false statements to the police and to other board members, and that my actions had caused Sharon to suffer severe emotional distress, damage to her reputation, and loss of her position in the HOA. I called David immediately, and he asked me to scan and email the complaint. He called me back an hour later. "This is a SLAP suit," David said. SLAP stands for Strategic Lawsuit Against Public Participation. It is a lawsuit designed to intimidate you and drain your resources rather than to actually win. California has strong anti-SLAP laws, and we can get this dismissed fairly quickly, but it is still going to cost you time and money. Can we countersue? Absolutely, and we will. This is clearly retaliatory, and it is going to look very bad for her, especially with the criminal case potentially moving forward. David filed a motion to strike the lawsuit under California's anti-SLAP statute, arguing that my reports to the police and my discussions with board members were protected activities. He also filed a counterclaim for malicious prosecution and abuse of process. While all of this was happening in the legal system, life in the neighborhood became increasingly tense. I noticed that some of my neighbors seemed to be avoiding me, probably not wanting to get involved in the drama. Others, however, reached out with support. Tom, my next-door neighbor, stopped by one evening with a 6-pack of beer. "I heard about what Sharon did," he said as we sat on my back patio. "That is completely insane. I have lived here for 8 years and she has always been a nightmare, but I never thought she would do something like that." "Has she ever targeted you?" "A few times. Mostly just nasty letters about stupid things. Last year she tried to fine me because my house numbers were not the exact right size according to the guidelines. I told her to pound sand, and eventually she gave up. I wish I had known about her reputation before this all started. Most people just try to fly under the radar and avoid her, but you did the right thing by fighting back. Someone needed to stand up to her." We drank our beers and talked about other things, but it was comforting to know I was not completely alone in this fight. A few weeks later, I received a call from Detective Morrison. She asked if I could come down to the station to discuss the case. I drove over that afternoon, and she met me in a small conference room. "I wanted to update you on the investigation," Detective Morrison said. "The DA has decided to file charges against Sharon Whitfield. She is being charged with 2 counts of unlawful interference with utility service, which is a misdemeanor, and 1 count of vandalism. There was also discussion of filing more serious charges, but the DA felt that these charges were appropriate given the circumstances." "When will she be arrested?" "Actually, that already happened this morning. She was booked and released on her own recognizance. Her arraignment is scheduled for next week." I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and disbelief. Sharon was actually facing criminal charges for what she had done. It was not just a civil matter anymore. She had been arrested. "What happens at the arraignment?" I asked. "She will enter a plea. If she pleads not guilty, the case will be set for trial. If she pleads guilty or no contest, she will be sentenced. Given that these are misdemeanors and she has no prior criminal record, she will probably get probation, community service, and fines. But she will have a criminal record. Will I have to testify? Possibly, if it goes to trial. But most cases like this end up with a plea deal. The evidence is pretty overwhelming, especially with the video you provided." I thanked Detective Morrison for the update and left the station feeling vindicated. Sharon had thought she was above the law, and now she was facing the consequences. The arraignment came and went. According to David, who had connections in the courthouse, Sharon had pleaded not guilty and was insisting on taking the case to trial. Her attorney was apparently trying to argue that she had made a mistake, but had not intended to cause harm. David thought it was a losing strategy. "The video shows clear intent," David said. "She went back a second time in the middle of the night. That is not a mistake. That is deliberate." In the meantime, David's motion to strike Sharon's lawsuit against me was successful. The judge agreed that it was a slap suit and dismissed it with prejudice, meaning Sharon could not refile it. The judge also awarded me attorney's fees, which meant Sharon would have to pay for the cost of defending against her baseless lawsuit. "She is burning through money fast," David said. "Between her criminal defense attorney and now having to pay your fees, she is probably tens of thousands of dollars in the hole. And that is not even counting the civil lawsuit we are preparing. We are still moving forward with that. Absolutely. You have suffered actual damages. You had to hire me, you had emotional distress, and there is the potential for punitive damages given how egregious her behavior was. I am confident we can win a substantial judgment." The civil lawsuit was filed a few weeks later. We sued both Sharon personally and the HOA for negligence in supervising her. The HOA's insurance company got involved at that point, and their attorneys reached out to David about a possible settlement. "They want to settle?" I asked, surprised. "The HOA does. They know they are liable for not reining her in sooner, and they do not want this dragging out. Sharon, on the other hand, is refusing to settle. She still thinks she did nothing wrong." The HOA offered a settlement of $25,000, which included an agreement that they would implement new policies and oversight to prevent this kind of abuse in the future. David advised me to accept it. "It is a fair offer, and it accomplishes your goals. You get compensated, and the HOA has to reform. Sharon is still on the hook for her portion, and we can continue to pursue her individually." I agreed, and the settlement was finalized. The HOA also sent a letter to every homeowner in the neighborhood explaining what had happened, and assuring everyone that new safeguards were in place. Sharon was officially removed from the board entirely, and the new president, Michael, seemed like a reasonable person who was genuinely interested in making the HOA functional rather than authoritarian. Sharon's criminal trial was scheduled for early August. David was not involved in that case since it was a criminal prosecution, but he kept tabs on it through his contacts. The trial lasted only 2 days. The prosecution presented the video evidence, the testimony from Officer Rodriguez and Detective Morrison, and my own testimony about what had happened. I sat in the witness box and calmly explained how I had come home to find my water shut off, how Sharon had admitted to doing it, and how she had done it again despite being confronted. The prosecutor asked me how it had affected me. "It was humiliating and frightening," I said honestly. "Water is something we take for granted until it is gone. I could not shower, could not cook, could not even flush my toilet, and the fact that someone did it deliberately out of spite made it even worse. I felt violated." Sharon's attorney tried to cross-examine me, suggesting that I had exaggerated the impact and that I could have simply gone to a hotel. I did not take the bait. "I should not have to go to a hotel because someone illegally shut off my water," I said calmly. "I pay my mortgage, I pay my water bill, and I follow the law. Sharon had no right to do what she did." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. They found Sharon guilty on all counts. The judge scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later. At the sentencing hearing, the judge was not gentle. Sharon had shown no remorse throughout the trial, and that clearly influenced the decision. She was sentenced to 1 year of probation, 200 hours of community service, a $5,000 fine, and she was ordered to pay restitution to me for my legal fees and other costs. The judge also gave her a stern lecture. "Miss Whitfield, you abused a position of trust in your community," the judge said. "You took it upon yourself to enforce rules in a manner that was not only unauthorized but illegal. You interfered with a basic necessity of life, and you did so twice. This behavior is unacceptable, and I hope this sentence impresses upon you the seriousness of your actions." Sharon stood there stone-faced, but I could see her hands trembling. She had gone from HOA president to convicted criminal in a matter of months. After the sentencing, David and I continued to pursue the civil case against Sharon personally. Her attorney reached out about a settlement, and after some negotiation, we agreed on a $40,000 judgment. Sharon's homeowner's insurance covered part of it, but she was still personally liable for a significant portion. David assured me that we could collect on the judgment if she tried to avoid paying. "She will probably have to sell some assets or take out a loan," David said. "But one way or another, you will get your money." The whole ordeal had lasted nearly 4 months from start to finish. It had been exhausting, stressful, and at times infuriating, but I had come out on top. Sharon had lost her position, her reputation, and a significant amount of money. She had a criminal record now, and everyone in the neighborhood knew exactly what she had done. Life slowly returned to normal after that. The new HOA board was reasonable and focused on actual community improvement rather than petty rule enforcement. They organized neighborhood events, maintained common areas, and generally stayed out of people's business unless there was a real issue. It was what an HOA should be. I did see Sharon around the neighborhood occasionally. She would drive by with a hard look on her face, but she never approached me or spoke to me. The restraining order eventually expired, but she seemed to have learned her lesson about staying away from my property. Tom and I became good friends through the whole experience. We would have beers on the weekend and joke about HOA horror stories. He told me that several other neighbors had reached out to him to say they were glad someone had finally stood up to Sharon. "You did the neighborhood a favor," Tom said one Saturday afternoon. "She made this place miserable for a lot of people. Now, everyone can just live their lives without worrying about some petty tyrant coming after them. I also made a point of staying involved with the HOA in a positive way. I attended meetings, volunteered for community events, and made sure my voice was heard when decisions were being made. I figured that if more reasonable people got involved, it would prevent someone like Sharon from taking over again. One evening in late September, I was sitting on my back patio watching the sunset when my phone rang. It was Patricia from the HOA board. "I just wanted to let you know that Sharon has put her house up for sale," Patricia said. "I saw the sign go up this afternoon." "Really?" "Yeah." I think between the criminal record, the financial hit, and the fact that everyone in the neighborhood knows what she did, she decided it was time to move on. I felt a sense of closure hearing that. Sharon was leaving, and the neighborhood would be better off without her. I hoped that wherever she moved, she would learn to mind her own business and not abuse whatever minor authority she might be given. A few weeks later, I saw the moving truck in front of Sharon's house. I watched from my window as she and her husband loaded boxes and furniture. She looked tired and defeated, and for a brief moment I almost felt sorry for her. But then I remembered coming home to no water, the stress of the legal battle, and the sheer audacity of her actions, and that sympathy evaporated. She had made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. After Sharon left, the neighborhood felt lighter somehow. People were friendlier, more willing to chat and get to know each other. The HOA became a genuine community organization rather than an enforcement arm. It was everything a neighborhood should be. I kept the security camera up on my front porch, more out of habit than necessity. It had saved me during the ordeal with Sharon, and it gave me peace of mind. I also kept the padlock on my water meter for a few months before finally removing it. I doubted anyone else would try what Sharon had done, but I wanted to be careful. David and I stayed in touch. He called me a few months later to let me know that the full restitution had been paid, partly through garnishment of Sharon's wages at her new job. I had not even known she was working, but apparently she had taken a position at some office across town. The $40,000 judgment plus all the other costs had hit her hard, but David was satisfied that justice had been served. "Cases like yours are why I do this work," David told me. HOAs can do a lot of good when they are run properly, but when they go bad, they can make people's lives miserable. I am glad we could hold Sharon accountable. I thanked him for everything he had done. Without his expertise and dedication, I probably would not have achieved nearly as complete a victory. As the holidays approached, the neighborhood looked festive and welcoming. The new HOA board had relaxed some of the more ridiculous rules about decorations, and people were allowed to express themselves within reason. My house had tasteful lights along the roofline and a wreath on the door. No one complained, no one sent nasty letters, and no one turned off my water. I hosted a small holiday party in December and invited several neighbors, including Tom and Patricia. We ate, drank, and laughed about how different the neighborhood felt now. Patricia told me that membership in the HOA had actually increased because people felt like they had a voice again. Before, people would just ignore the HOA entirely because Sharon made it so toxic, Patricia explained. Now we have people volunteering for committees and actually participating. It is amazing what happens when you treat people with respect. I raised my glass in a toast. To reasonable HOAs and to neighbors who look out for each other. Everyone clinked glasses, and I felt genuinely grateful for how things had turned out. What had started as a nightmare scenario had ultimately led to positive change, not just for me but for the entire community. In January, I received a final letter from David's office. It was a summary of the case, including all the settlements, judgments, and outcomes. The total amount I had recovered was over $70,000 when you included the HOA settlement, Sharon's personal judgment, attorney fees, and restitution. It was far more than I had expected, and it covered all my costs, and then some. But more than the money, what mattered was the principle. Sharon had thought she could bully me into submission, and instead, she had lost everything. The criminal conviction would follow her for the rest of her life. Any future employer, landlord, or volunteer organization would see that she had been convicted of tampering with utilities and vandalism. Her reputation was permanently tarnished. I did not take pleasure in her downfall exactly, but I felt satisfied that the system had worked. She had committed crimes, and she had been held accountable. That was how it was supposed to work. As winter turned to spring, I found myself reflecting on the whole experience. It had been stressful and time-consuming, but it had also taught me important lessons about standing up for yourself and not backing down in the face of unreasonable authority. Sharon had counted on me being too intimidated or too busy to fight back. She had been wrong. I also learned the value of documentation. The security camera footage had been crucial evidence, and keeping detailed records of every interaction had helped build a strong case. In any dispute, especially one involving someone in a position of authority, documentation was everything. One warm afternoon in April, I was mowing my lawn when a car pulled up and a young couple got out. They looked at Sharon's old house, which had been sold a few months earlier, and then walked over to me. "Hi, we are thinking about buying a house in this neighborhood," the woman said. "Can I ask you what it is like living here?" I turned off the mower and smiled. "It is a great neighborhood, friendly people, well-maintained, and the HOA is actually reasonable." "We have heard horror stories about HOAs," the man said. "We are a little nervous." "There was an issue with the previous HOA president," I said carefully. "But she is gone now, and the current board is focused on actual community improvement. They are not looking to nickel and dime you over minor stuff." "That is good to hear," the woman said, looking relieved. They thanked me and went back to their car. I watched them drive off and hoped they would decide to move in. The neighborhood needed more good people, and it needed fewer tyrants like Sharon. As I finished mowing the lawn, I thought about how close I had come to just accepting what Sharon had done. If I had been more passive, if I had just fixed my lawn and repainted my mailbox and kept my head down, she would have gotten away with it. And she probably would have done it to someone else. By fighting back, I had not only protected myself, but also protected future residents from her abuse. That felt important. The oak trees that gave Oak Valley its name were in full bloom now, their branches heavy with green leaves. Kids were playing in the street, riding bikes and drawing with chalk on the sidewalks. It felt like a real community, the kind of place where people wanted to live. I went inside, grabbed a cold drink from the fridge, and sat on my back patio. The water from the tap flowed smoothly and reliably, as it should. I would never take that for granted again. My phone buzzed with a text from Tom asking if I wanted to come over for a barbecue that weekend. I replied yes and set the phone down. Life was good. The neighborhood was peaceful, and Sharon Whitfield was someone else's problem now. I finished my drink and went back outside to water my plants. The hose sprayed cool water across the flower beds, and I felt a deep sense of contentment. I had fought for my rights, I had won, and I had come out stronger for it. In the end, that was all that mattered. Sharon had tried to use her petty authority to make my life difficult, and instead, she had destroyed her own life. Justice had been served, the neighborhood was better off, and I could finally move on. As the sun set over Oak Valley that evening, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I stood in my front yard and looked around at the peaceful street. This was my home, and no one was going to take that away from me. Not Sharon, not any future HOA tyrant, not anyone. I had learned that standing up for yourself was not always easy, but it was always worth it. And if I ever faced a situation like this again, I would be ready. But for now, I was content to just enjoy my home, my neighborhood, and my hard-won peace. The story of Sharon Whitfield and her criminal charges had become something of a legend in Oak Valley. New residents would hear about it and shake their heads in disbelief. Longtime residents would nod knowingly and say they were glad someone had finally dealt with her. And I would just smile and say that I had done what anyone should do when faced with injustice. I had fought back. And that, ultimately, was the lesson of the whole ordeal. Power, even the small power of an HOA president, could corrupt. But accountability, whether through the legal system or community action, could restore balance. Sharon had learned that the hard way, and I hoped anyone else considering similar behavior would learn from her example. As I locked my front door that night and turned off the lights, I felt genuinely at peace. The nightmare was over. Sharon was gone. Justice had been served. And life in Oak Valley was better than ever. I climbed into bed and closed my eyes, listening to the quiet sounds of the neighborhood settling in for the night. Tomorrow would be another good day, and the day after that, and the day after that. Because I had stood up for myself, because I had refused to be a victim, and because I had seen the fight through to the end. Sharon Whitfield had turned off my water, thinking she could bully me into submission. Instead, she had triggered her own downfall. And now, as I drifted off to sleep, I knew that my home was truly mine, that my rights were protected, and that no petty tyrant would ever threaten me like that again. The water flowed freely, the neighborhood thrived, and justice had been served. It was everything I could have hoped for and more.